Hi, everyone. Welcome. Oh, wow. Look how amazing you all look. Such fresh faces, all ready to get angry. Thank you so much for coming today. I have to say, I was just talking to Soraya backstage, and I have to say that I read this book from cover to cover, and with almost every page, I was like, yes, yes, yes! And my poor husband had to contend with, let me tell you about this. Let me just read you something here. Poor suffering husband. But, very early on in our relationship, my husband quickly learned that there are two words to never say to an angry woman. Any of you know what those words are? Oh. Calm down. No. Never in the history of calming down have the words calm down had the desired effect of calming anybody down. Now, this is because, and there's something about women who know this, it's innate in us, and we know this. The effect actually is to make us quiet. Women know that these words put together are meant to dismiss our concerns, trivialize our emotions, ignore our voices, and we know it. And that's why we get angry at the words calm down. Never tell an angry woman to calm down. But also very early on in our relationship, my husband also very quickly learned never to believe the two words that I'd spit back at him. Do you know what the two words are? You're me, aren't you? I'm fine. Yeah. That's because I wasn't fine. And we all know we're not fine. But it had been ingrained to never show anger, displeasure, never rock the boat, because as a woman expressing a strong emotion, I would be mocked for being emotional, hysterical, unreasonable. So, keep it in check, girl. Internalize the rage, and then in your quiet moments, go eat that full box of Tim Tams, and then throw up. Sometimes in extremes, cut yourself. But whatever it is, don't bring attention to your anger, your strong emotions, because you'll make other people uncomfortable. Somewhere along the way, I met other silent, angry women who did or did not eat the full box of Tim Tams. They had other things to do. And we all realized that collective anger can bring out constructive change. We saw it here in Australia, marriage equality for gay couples. We saw the removal of refugee children from Manus Island. Globally, we saw the Me Too movement, a demand to no longer have our thoughts, emotions be trivialized, overlooked, or ignored. And that movement continues. Our anger continues, and it is constructive, it is making change. There's a lot to be angry about as a woman. The list goes on: incoming inequality, sexism, fear of violence, discrimination, healthcare. The list goes on, as I said. But what do we do with that anger? Do we seethe? Do we continue to say, I'm fine? Or do we channel it constructively? Our next speaker says that the first step is to embrace your anger, is to be comfortable with it, and, like superheroes, use the power for good. Please welcome to the Sydney Opera House and to the Drama Theatre, award-winning writer and activist and director of the Women's Media Centre Speech Project, Soraya Chemaly.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here this afternoon, and also to All About Women and the Sydney Opera House. It's really been wonderful to listen to the other speakers, and I'm looking forward very much actually to your questions at the end of this session. I wish that it were an easy thing to say to people, to women, embrace your anger, but it's really not an easy thing to do, because in fact, overwhelmingly in our cultures, we consider anger to be possibly the most negative emotion, the one to be avoided, the emotion that might break relationships and cause real harm. And stepping back from those ideas and unlearning them takes a very long time. But we have to remember that it took a very long time to learn them in the first place. I wrote the book that I wrote, a book that Edwina just recently called A Short History of Everything That Will Irritate You. I wrote it after our presidential election because anger was so palatable. It was evident at every stage of the electoral process. It was evident on the left, it was evident on the right. But it also was glaringly evident that some people's anger had more uptake and more public recognition and more civic value. And those people were not women. They were not women as members of the electorate, as citizens, or as candidates. So in our case, if you think about Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, they could leverage populist rage, and they could thump their podiums and get righteously angry and look unhinged, and they gained influence. They gained resonance in the process of running their campaigns. Whereas Hillary Clinton, the last woman standing, had to stay incredibly composed and calm and couldn't win either way. Because if she tried to do the same thing, she'd be castigated. And if she stayed calm, she was inauthentic. And that happens to women every day. It happens in our homes. It happens in our professional lives. It was a very familiar experience. And watching that happen at a time when there was such evident intersectional misogyny, racism, xenophobia directed at women and children and men of color was very difficult. So I'd been writing about gender and social justice for a long time and decided to use this lens of anger. We know from experience that expressing anger is difficult for almost all people, but particularly for women. And without going into lots of details, it's very clearly the case, which study after study after study shows, that if a man expresses anger, it may not be welcome, and it may be expressed in a more physical way, a more aggressive and maybe threatening way, but it does mean power. It may be negative, but it's also associated with masculinity and leadership and credibility and authority. In a black man in America, it's also associated with criminality. But even so, the threat that that represents is a form of power in the society that maybe backfires because of racism. When women express the same, even if it's a righteous rage, even if it's in self-defense, they grow more powerless. If you ask women about their experiences of anger, they associate it with powerlessness. If a man gets angry, he feels guilt. That's a particular thing because it means I've done something wrong. I've acted in a way that maybe I shouldn't have acted. It actually implies that you have control over that. When women report their responses to their own anger, they talk about shame. And that's different because it implies I am wrong. There's something inherently wrong with my being, particularly when I behave in these ways. This starts very, very early in our lives. So studies show that gendered parenting and adult interactions cultivate an affiliation for boys with aggression and anger as markers of masculinity. We discourage those in girls, and instead we tend to cultivate the expression of sadness or fear. So adults looking at an infant, if they think that infant is a boy and the child is acting in a sort of irritated and tetchy way, flailing about, making lots of noise, they'll describe the boy in terms of anger, in terms of aggression or disagreeableness. The same baby, if they think it's a girl, they use a totally different set of vocabulary. They'll use words like sad. They'll describe the girl in language that suggests vulnerability and need. And that difference continues throughout our lives. We see that in studies also in adult women. So in marriages, for example, heterosexual marriages, most women asked about anger, they describe expressing their anger either as sadness or fear. So how many people here have cried when they're angry? Now, I really do believe that most men would be shocked if they understood how insanely angry women are when they cry. Because crying confirms feminine ideals. It's less threatening. And it's not that we think, I'm really angry, I should cry now. It's more that we've just been socialized to process this emotion that way and actually not name it as anger. I, for example, have cried and then hours, days, weeks, years later come to the realization that I was so pissed off that I could not get words out. And the thing about that is if you can't label the emotion, you cannot make meaning of it, and you cannot demand accountability and change. And unfortunately, that is how we tend to socialize girls. We actually cultivate that wordlessness, that lack of language, that lack of self-understanding by developing a sort of nurturing association with femininity. There's nothing wrong with nurturing. As a matter of fact, we need a lot more of it in the world. In boys, however, to express sadness or fear is considered unmanly. It's often discouraged explicitly in boys because it's a feminine behavior. So we need to de-gender the way we're talking to children. I'm going to tell you just a couple of stories because I've really focused on individuals and the way we talk to children, but I want to make the point that these are public and very political decisions that we don't make. We just by default create this environment. I have a story in my book about an incident with one of our daughters. She was building a castle. She was very small. A boy kept knocking it over. And the interaction in the classroom, because he was not expected to control himself, and she was, he was not actually held accountable. And I participated in this. I tried to teach her how to be nice, to use her words, to do all of these kinds of stay safe rules. Because he wasn't held accountable, we failed both of those children. We created a specific male entitlement that is directly relevant to anger, and that's the taking up and control of space. Anger takes up a lot of space. And so by not holding this child accountable, by not saying, stop destroying her castle every morning, we actually, by default, let him control the space, and she had to work around him. This core belief that boys can't control themselves is part of what Gemma was talking about. I don't know if anybody went to the talk about emotional labor and fed up, but we teach girls explicitly to not only be responsible for their own emotions, but also the emotional regulation of people around them. So not only do you not express your own anger, but you learn to de-escalate and control, theoretically, which is not true, I don't think, control the anger of the people around you by abnegating your own needs. And unfortunately, those are very powerful childhood lessons. The incident with the castle is not atypical, actually. A few years later, I had another daughter. There was a boy in her class that had a crush on her. They were 8. And she came home one day. She was very upset because he followed her around every day. He kept writing her notes. He kept telling everybody they were in love. Nothing worked, and she didn't want to go to school because she was uncomfortable and she was angry. And in this case, her teacher appreciated what was happening, but had spoken to the parents, and they had not discouraged him from continuing because they felt that this was part of his development and that he should be allowed to express himself. So I called the parents directly, and I knew these parents, and it was interesting because what his mother said to me was, couldn't she write him a letter and let him know how she felt? And I said, she has let him know how she felt. She has not responded. She has declined to engage with him. He needs to understand that that is a no. She is not obligated to spend the time to help him in his developmental process. And but I will say this because saying that to a friend or acquaintance is hard. It creates conflict, and we aren't supposed to create conflict. We're supposed to make people comfortable. And so anger, we learn, brings with it this huge discomfort, and we learn it very, very young. Those are interpersonal exchanges. I'm going to move now to an institutional exchange. Fast forward maybe 4 years, I have another daughter, I have a lot of daughters, another daughter, and she's in 8th grade. And I'm sure this is familiar to many people. I went to a Catholic school, I wore a uniform, there were dress codes, and they segregated the boys and the girls. They took the girls into an auditorium. They told them that their way of using their uniforms was distracting the boys and unprofessional. And they took a girl up on stage, and they drew on her leg where her skirt should be, and everyone had a good laugh. And my daughter stood up and said, "I'm sorry, why are the boys not in this room? Because if they're distracted, you should be talking to them." And for raising this concern, a child like this who doesn't hedge, she doesn't say, "I'm sorry, I just think," which I still struggle not to do. I say, "I'm sorry," and that's considered disruptive. It's not considered a sign of leadership that she would defend the girls in the room or stand up for her own rights. It's seen as a form of aggression. Now, when they took this child up on the stage, they actually modeled a specific type of dynamic and behavior. They used her body as a prop. They confused her acquiescence, because they had more power, for consent. They showed that older, bigger people with more power can take this child, put her on the stage. Now imagine that happening over and over and over again, which it does all the time. Now you go to university, and you have an interaction that some people think is murky and gray, and it's sexual, and a girl is sexually threatened and possibly raped, and she freezes. She has an instinct, and it's not fight or flight, because that doesn't make sense for women. Our response in times of threat and anger is better described by researchers as tend and befriend. So we freeze, we smile, we de-escalate. We aren't aggressive because aggression has been so discouraged, and it comes with huge risk. And so all these lessons accrue in childhood. And in the end, what we're doing is we're growing girls to be pleasers and not knowers. We're growing boys to think in terms of being active, and girls still to think in terms of being passive. And that's despite a lot of great changes that have happened in the world to try and change that, to equalize that field. The thing about anger is it's all about subjectivity and knowledge. It brings great information. But when you say you're angry, if you're a little girl, whether you're just being assertive or actually aggressive or angry, those distinctions aren't made, because what you're doing is you're actually centering yourself, and we expect girls not to do that as they get older. So we go from these very personal interactions, which are practice for our professional interactions and our political interactions. And the knowledge that comes with our anger, if we can't label it, if we can't expect respect for it, gets lost. It gets lost in our media, in the way we tell stories, the way we frame stories, the use of language. It gets lost in our politics when we decide what's politically important. I think that the ever-constant threat of rape that infuses women's lives is a degradation of democracy, and that our political system should recognize it as a major threat. But our political system doesn't agree. I think intimate partner violence is the same thing. But our political system, although it's tipping its hat in country after country at the notion, still doesn't agree that it's a priority. So one of the last things I'll say before we start talking is that in the research that I did, it was very apparent that most women, when they are going to be angry, what they dread the most isn't retaliation or violence, although those two exist. It's this quality of mockery, of being made fun of. And we know the stereotypes. You're an angry black woman, you're a hot Hispanic woman, you're a sad Asian woman, you're a crazy white woman. All of those are silencing. They're silencing phrases. It starts off when we're young. She's just a spoiled brat. She's a little princess. She's a hormonal teen. She's a nag. She's a high-maintenance bitch. I mean, it just never, ever ends. And that kind of language we need to be able to confront, and we need other people to confront it. And we need people to actually be allies and to respect the words that we say when we have this problem. I think that, even in an interpersonal relationship, if you can't say, this is what I'm angry about, because you're fearful of what the men in your life are going to say, you don't have an egalitarian relationship. You don't actually have a relationship of mutual care. If you're at work and you have a specific kind of anger and you fear retaliation, In fact, there are probably other people who feel the way you feel. And the important thing there, because responses to anger are so contextual, is to find those people, to work in unity, to find allies, to confront the problem. And a lot of, for example, the Me Too stories that we've come to learn do that. They're about sharing those stories and trying to challenge institutions. On the political front, I think we have so many examples of the kind of positive anger that we need to be talking about and thinking about. On the right, we have this anger of resentment. It's fueled by contempt and disgust, and it's really a looking back, right? It's an aggrieved entitlement. But there's also this anger of hope, which is fueled and related to compassion and social justice. It's very joyful, it brings together communities. And what I'm trying to say in the book is that we have to acknowledge that too. We have to acknowledge that that is a kind of anger that needs to be respected. And I don't mean by that a destructive venting anger, because in fact that's also dysfunctional. That's not very useful. But there are many ways to think about this emotion and then to use it constructively. I want to end with one story of something that happened to me actually day before yesterday to describe the long tail of this notion of space and the way we teach girls and women to make space, either physically or emotionally or politically for men. I was in an airplane, it was very late, I'd been on many airplanes. I sat down, the plane took off, I leaned back. I was happy to lean back. And the flight attendant came over and asked me to move my seat up. And it's funny because 2 days before I had the same thing happen, and I didn't think, I just moved it up. And I thought, oh, she must need me to move it up. I didn't think about it. But what this flight attendant said was, the man behind you is uncomfortable. And I said, oh, that's too bad. I'm uncomfortable. And she said, we just thought it would be nice if you moved your seat up. And I said, it would be nice. And no, but while it was happening, my heart was beating. I felt flushed. But I could think about what was happening very clearly. And she said, well, it's just that, he needs a little more space. And I said, I bought this seat, and it came with this button. And my understanding is that I can push the button and push my seat back unless there's some other problem. And she said, well, there are 3 chairs, there are 3 empty seats, and they were right next to this man. If you need more space, you can sit there. And I said, I don't need more space. I'm fine. She asked him if he wanted the seats, and he wouldn't move. And through this whole interaction, I felt panicked. And I thought, now I'm the bitchy one. I'm the one who's made a problem in this scenario because she doesn't perceive that I have an equal right to this seat or this space or to the comfort that this man is demanding. I didn't say that to her in that way. But what was really jarring, and I think so emblematic of what we're facing, is that just before we landed, another flight attendant barreled down the aisle and loudly proclaimed that she was giving him a credit for his forbearance. And at that point, I honestly thought, I'm so happy it's not noon and I just have my 3 shots of espresso. Because I was tired, I walked out and I filed a complaint at the desk. And I found out what their regulations were. But that's a small thing, But it did require, it required the effort. And in fact, it requires all of us to recognize the microaggressive quality of the problem. And to claim the right to those kinds of spaces. So I'm going to stop now. I've probably gone over time. But thank you.
Now, just before we begin the conversation, just wanted to alert you that there are 2 microphones on either side of the theatre, and we will be taking your questions just a little later. Just do keep in mind that they're questions, and they don't go on forever, and there's a point to the question. Make sure there's a question mark at the end of it. Okay. Now, I think we can all relate to that feeling of, I have a right to my own rights. But then there's that horrible, nauseous feeling of, your heart palpitations. You start to break out in sweat.
I don't want to be difficult.
I don't want to be difficult. I don't want to rock the boat. I don't want to be the bitch in this situation.
Right.
So let's just start then. Let me just ask you, what is the difference between assertiveness, aggression, and anger?
So I try and define that quite explicitly in the book, but anger is an emotion. We all have it. We're human. We have this emotion. Some of us lose the ability to recognize it. We so deeply self-surveil and self-objectify, which frankly we encourage girls to do. We encourage girls to be pleasing to others, to look pretty, to put their needs first, to say nice things, to say thank you when they don't mean to smile more often. I mean, these studies are quite profuse. There's no ambiguity about the difference in politeness norms that accrue to boys and girls. And so that emotion is a feeling. Assertiveness is stating a position with confidence. Aggression is doing that in a way that is seen as threatening, or pushy is a word that's often used. But aggressiveness is a behavior, and assertiveness, I would say, is a way of speaking or presenting your arguments. But those three things don't get distinguished much in girls. And at least in the United States, if you are a girl of color or a black girl, it's not just that you might get scolded in school. It's that you will be suspended and expelled in school because you're perceived as belligerent. So if you are sassy, if you are louder than middle-class white femininity norms would demand, if you're acting in assertive or physically aggressive ways that in boys are seen as natural and qualities of leadership, you could very well find yourself suspended or expelled.
I want to come back to just being comfortable with that uncomfortableness of being angry and having a strong emotion. But first, I want to come to this quote that I read in your book, and it's one of these things where I've stood up and I went, yes! And you say, severing anger from femininity severs women and girls from the emotion that best protects us from injustice and danger. Just explain to us.
So as an emotion, anger is really vital to human development and evolution because it warns us of threat, of indignity, of harm, of risk, of anything in our environment that might hurt us or that raises a red flag, that makes us feel uncomfortable. It's quite rational. Anger is usually a sort of a rational response. Now, if we don't attend to that anger, if it sits in us, if it never has any power or uptake, it will fester. It becomes material in the body. We end up engaging in behaviors that undermine us or undermine other women and girls, or leading quite unhealthy lives. We end up doing things like saying, I'm stressed or I'm tired, when what we really mean is, I'm furious and I feel powerless because the people around me are not helping me. My society does not care that what I'm saying is important matters. But what happens as adults, particularly in our political life, is men will express anger, and it might make people uncomfortable, but it confirms masculinity. So in the workplace or in politics, they actually gain in influence and power. So think about Brett Kavanaugh and Christine Blasey Ford. Now, Dr. Ford was calm and composed, and she was scared at the beginning of her testimony. I personally thought the most heartbreaking moment of her testimony was when she described deference for one of the men questioning her, and she talked about collegiality. And my heart sank because I thought, no, they do not feel this for you. They do not consider you a peer. Not only was she a witness, she was also an expert witness. She is a professional in this field. She was sort of doing multiple things at the same time. She was managing her own trauma and trying to manage the trauma of people around her. And they dismissed all of that. And then Brett Kavanaugh sat there and threw his tantrum and snarled and pounded and defended his honor, when in fact the person in the room that had the right to do any of that was this woman, but she couldn't do it. And we all know why she couldn't do it. And Anita Hill couldn't do it. And so what was most interesting to me was that after this display, which to some of us was so ridiculous and repugnant, Brett Kavanaugh's approval ratings in conservative circles went up because his display was considered a confirmation of the manly right to defend your honor in this setting. We lose that ability, is what I'm saying. We can't actually defend ourselves.
Well, this, and I want to continue with that line. We can't defend ourselves, and we feel that we don't have the right to defend ourselves. Would that explain why a lot of women perhaps stay in violent relationships? Is that the extreme?
So I think actually that's such a complex scenario because intimate partner violence includes so many levels of control and power and coercion, financial dependence. In intimate partner violent situations, what we're really seeing is a microcosm of the structural oppression that we encounter. Because women have less access to resources, because they're responsible for providing the unpaid labor of care work for children, because their work lives are interrupted, because we don't have a sort of workplace that can adapt to the cadence of those needs, they're much more dependent. I mean, when women don't leave, some of it has to do with damaged egos and physical assault, but a lot of it has to do with just the practical reality that there's nowhere to go and that there's no money to feed children with. And when we say, why didn't she leave, or why didn't she fight back, that just reflects an immense ignorance about the obstacles that women face just to stay safe and fed with children.
And it's almost a blame. They blame her.
It's a victim blaming.
It's her fault. She stayed.
And in fact, in victim blaming scenarios, which people with more gender binary conservative ideas are much more likely to victim blame. And the funny thing about victim blaming is that there is no actual victim, because in that mindset, in that way of thinking, the victim is usually to blame. If you're poor, it's because you're lazy. If you're in jail, it's because you committed a crime. If you're raped, what were you doing there in the first place? You know, and so the same thing with domestic violence situations.
I want to broaden the conversation out a little bit more. One of my favorite quotes from the book is, "It is not just a coincidence that we are at an uncomfortable strategic inflection point for the rights of girls and women, just as we face grave threats to democratic values and the health of the planet. One cannot be separated from the other. This is an era of angry women and women willing to make noise." So you see a correlation with the rise of angry female voices and the rise of the authoritarian leader, like we see in Trump, Bolsonaro, Duterte in the Philippines.
So authoritarianism usually thrives in societies with grave inequalities. And the violence begins with the most vulnerable in a community. What I find most, and that's often children and women, marginalized people of all kinds. But what I find interesting is that global studies really show that the first people to embrace an authoritarian leader tend to be women, and they tend to be women in the most unequal of circumstances, because they're looking for a strong rule of law. They want protection that they simply don't have in their society, but especially don't have in their intimate lives. And I think that's really telling, because gender inequality is something that we tend to put in a box, put on a shelf, and pull out with some touchy, loud feminists make you do it.
Yeah.
But in fact, if you don't have the baseline of physical security in your own society, which women don't anywhere, we don't have that baseline, that is a meaningful factor in the failure of democracy. It's a meaningful factor in the failure to recognize who has citizenship in a society and how much we care about that citizenship. Can women speak freely? Can they walk freely? We can't. We can't do those things. And so I do think that in times of high political conflict, which we're all in right now, it's very clear from history that women are given more freedom to express themselves in these ways. But usually what happens in the course of change over time is that when things calm down again, women are expected to go back to their space. And I'm just curious, I'm quite cynical, but still hopeful. I'm just curious to see how much that happens this time.
I'm going to take a pause here and just remind the audience that we've got about 15 minutes left. So if you do have a question, you may want to start making your way to the microphones. There's microphone 1 there, microphone 2 there. So make your way there, and just remember, question, not a statement. And there's a point and a question mark somewhere in the statement or the question. So I want to go back to how do we deal with the anger. And yes, you're right, we've been there. Heart palpitations, anger, tears start to well up. No matter how much you try,
Yes.
however much you dig your fingernails into your hand,
Yes.
the tears well up. How then do you control that anger? How do you make it constructive so that actual constructive words
Right, come out of your mouth,
Yeah.
right? Which is super hard, to be honest.
that you're able to actually demand what you want
So
and be heard?
So there are a few things, I think, and I think it depends, again, on the context. I think it also depends on age, to be honest. I could never have done any of those things in my 20s. I was just too scared, and I probably would have simply moved my seat, because of course I'd move my seat. That's what I should do. So several things. One is you have to practice, which is really uncomfortable for your family. Okay?
Yeah.
Really uncomfortable for your parents and your spouses and your children and your friends and your schools. Everybody's really uncomfortable. But the way I think of it is that we've been given this arena of care. We are responsible for care. We're responsible for raising children. Men are doing more of that, but not nearly enough, to be honest. We still do, on average around the world, 2 hours more of unpaid labor. Girls start doing that as children. The chore gap between boys and girls is about 2 hours. Boys are paid more for their chores. They're paid more often for their chores. And we don't think about that. It just kind of happens because this is the biggest problem. It's just traditional habit. We're tired. We're trying to go as fast as we can. And there's a great study called Seeing the Unseen, which is about discrimination, everyday discrimination. And in fact, if you ask people to look, which is essentially all I'm doing in this book, then they start noticing. Then they start feeling angry. They start feeling that sense of unfairness you may have had when you were 4. And actually, as an adult, the anger that I didn't name it or recognize it for a long time. But once I did, I had this tremendous memory that I loved of being this child again that understood how I felt. Somewhere along the line, how I felt became detached from who I was because my anger was so incompatible in my imagination with being a good person or being a good woman. That's the other thing, because it's really not just femininity, it's good womanhood specifically. And so you have to yourself get comfortable with the words. From what I have understood from research and actually my own experience is it's highly recommended that you write, because in writing, it makes you think about what you're feeling and put words to it very carefully, so that when you are confronted with a situation, you'll have a language and a thought process. Even if your heart is racing, you still are able to think about it and then stand firm.
Great tips. Write it down.
Write it down.
Bullet points, you know what to say.
I have inflicted my anger on you now.
All right, let's throw it open to the floor. Let's start with microphone 1. And please, again, just a reminder, make it brief. We do have quite a few people who want to ask questions.
Hi.
Hi.
My question is about, you were talking about the socialization of women not recognizing anger as an emotion. And it really resonated with me because I can think of all of the times that I've cried when I'm just like, oh my God, I'm so angry. But for me, I think I found that it's more the crying comes from the expectation of a lack of response to the anger rather than
Powerlessness.
Recognition from me, the anger is there. I'm fully aware that I'm angry. So I'm just curious, like, how you see, like, the interplay of the socialization to not recognize the emotion, but also once you do recognize the emotion, the expectation that there's no response that will be adequate.
So I think that you're really describing what so many women describe, which is the feeling of powerlessness that comes with anger. And I've thought about this a lot because we really are taught that our anger is going to be damaging to us and to the people around us, and that it's going to break relationships. And by relationships, I mean all kinds. With someone in your home or your family or someone in your workplace. It will break your relationship with your boss if you're angry in the wrong way, right? But I don't actually think that's the right threat. I think the deeper threat is that in expressing what's important to us, we are taking the risk of having to come to terms that those people don't care.
Yeah.
That's harder.
Yeah.
That's even harder than the risk that we might break the relationships, because what it means is that we are prioritizing other people, but the society around us, the community around us, the people around us don't reciprocate. And actually, even though that's sad and uncomfortable, it is actually a form of power. Because if you come to terms with what is the hurtfulness of that, it's kind of liberating, because then you know where you stand, and then you can make changes that have to be made. If you're in a job where you're crying because you're angry, then you have to make a plan to leave that job, because you realize that the people are not going to change. The institution is not going to change. And you can decide, am I going to fight this institution? Am I going to find allies? Am I going to form a union? Or am I going to go find a place that will not put me in this position on a regular basis?
It's to take back the power, really.
Well, I think that it's hard, right? It's hard to realize that maybe people around you don't care. You're being careful, literally careful, and they're not. And that's important to know.
Thank you for your question. Let's go to microphone 2.
Hello, I'm a flight attendant and I would have never have asked you to put your seat up.
Thank you.
As I went on maternity leave, sorry my voice is shaking, I got asked to stand in a position on the plane where I didn't have to stand, and I had like quite a big belly. And I said no, and my voice shook as it is now.
Yes.
And I ended up getting taken into the flight deck and asked why I wouldn't do this task. I ended up on my last flight walking off with my pregnant belly and my bags, and that was my last flight as a flight attendant. I took it further and I took it down the kind of political channels to fight it. But this systemic problem of inequality and not being seen in society still greatly exists. And it feeds back into what you were saying. Do we keep fighting if our voices shake and if we're tired and we're distressed? And if we don't, do we just pass those problems on to the next ones? Because it's easy to just not go back to that place, but then other women will continue to have to work in those industries.
So I would say that's all industries.
Yeah.
There are very few industries. I love in the news when people say, she works in a male-dominated industry. And I'm like, she does. But you have to decide, right? You have to, it's exhausting. This is the thing about this problem of inequality. It is profoundly exhausting. And the liberating thing about aging is you don't care so much. And yeah, and so I think of feminism as a baton passing exercise all the time. I have a community of feminists around me, and I thankfully have my family around me, supporting me. And I know that there are times when I am suffering from secondary trauma, for example. I write a lot about sexualized violence, and I know when I need to stop. I just need to stop and take a step back. But I also know that 5 other women that I know and love and respect are continuing for this period of time, and when one of them gets tired, I might start again. And you have to do what you can. I mean, I think what you did, you stood your ground, shaky voice and all, and that was important. And it was not just important for you, but even if you don't know it, other people saw you do it, probably. And I think that modeling that behavior is important. Also showing that there are limits, because in fact, we're just dealing with the raw reality of power. I mean, the example of my plane, what really struck me about it was a contestation of space in addition to will. The plane is built in a way that makes it a zero-sum game. The seat goes back, that person has less space, the seat comes forward, this person has less space. It's a stupid way to design planes. Right? And we live with really stupidly designed systems that impose costs on us all the time. So
Great. Bravo on you too. Well done.
yeah.
Microphone 1.
So far, thank you for all the words and ideas that have been raised here. Mine touches on something that was mentioned earlier. The danger of women internalizing their rage, which happens more often than not, is that it does become expressed in dangerous ways, such as self-harm, eating disorders, other issues, but I see that those issues are really prevalent, not with just myself, but my peers and younger women. So my question is, how do we take that internalized rage, which does exhibit, in behaviours that are destructive to ourselves, and channel that into being constructive, especially once those habits do become reinforced in our groups and within our peers?
So the quick and easy, completely impossible, impractical suggestion is that we teach feminism in schools starting in kindergarten. Right? And that is an unwelcome idea, because feminism is an interestingly constructed word. We have racism, that's bad. We have sexism, that's bad. And then we have feminism, that must be bad. Right? I mean, even the construction of the way we think about these words, it's really easy to turn it against us, right? But I'm a humanist, which is not true. Like humanism's a totally different thing. But I think that at least what I tried to do with this book is provide an intellectual framework and a language and an understanding of why it would be that girls and women hurt themselves. And I wrote it because I'm really sick of so many girls and women I know hurting themselves because they don't understand what's happening to them. Literally, they have not been given the information or the language to deal with it, and they're expected to absorb it all on their own. The example I use actually in my book is about, I had a great-grandmother who was 14 when she was, today she'd be called a kidnapped bride, but the way my family's fairy tale went, she was a beautiful girl, she was out for a walk, a handsome man on a horse came by, picked her up, rode off, they had 7 children, and here we are, it's so romantic. And, if you're 5, that sounds great, because all of a sudden you have a princess in your family. But when you're 11, as I was, and I'd already had someone threaten to rape me in a schoolyard, and I'd already had 2 or 3 years of constant street harassment, it didn't sound that great. So at that point, I said to my family, it really sounds like she was kidnapped and raped serially and carted across the world and never saw her family again, and he should go to jail. And that was my great-grandfather, and he was about 5 foot tall. He looked really cheerful all the time, and it's complicated. Misogyny is really complicated. But what was interesting is that example, when I said that, nobody responded to me. Nobody said it was awful what happened to her. Nobody said, are you scared or worried about something that would make you think that way? There was just silence. And that happens at a macro level in our society because our stories about violence against women are still not being framed or chosen or told by the people experiencing the violence so much. We have more of it because of things like Me Too or Yes All Women, but we lack the public understanding of women's experiences because they're shrouded in shame and because they're isolating. So things like destigmatizing menstruation, period stigma, body shaming. All of those may seem superficial to some people, but they're so important because actually they're about knowledge. How do you experience the world? How do we experience world in different bodies, in different contexts, in different social strata, with different gender and sexuality identities? But for young girls in particular, we leave them pretty high and dry, and we grow them to think they have power and equality. And you don't want to take their sense of confidence away, but you also want to prepare them and arm them to not hurt themselves. And I think that's just about speaking to them, especially though, speaking to the boys. Like, we keep talking about having better role models for girls, and I'm like, girls are fine on that front. Because in fact, we've always had to cross-gender empathize. We've always had to put ourselves in the shoes and feet of boys and men in our books, in our stories, in our politics, in our sports. That's a gift in some ways, because that empathy is so important. But boys and men rarely have to do that. And so we actually need the women role models for the boys. We need boys to know that it's okay to want to be like this woman. Yeah. And right now, that's not happening so much.
Yeah. We've got just about enough time for one question, unfortunately. Yeah, I do apologize. Listen, if this is a really quick one, we'll try and get
I'll
some
be
more.
short. I'll stop talking.
All right, quick.
Hello. My question is in regards to women helping other women. I feel like something I'm constantly saying to my friends is, I'm outraged on your behalf. I'm angry on your behalf. If they're telling me stories in passing about work, and I'll say, wait, you should be angry about this. Why aren't you more angry about this? Which obviously probably isn't helpful. Mm-hmm. I don't want the friends to think they can't tell me these things because this is how I'm going to react. So I'm wanting to know, how can other women help each other with this so that we can be open with each other without feeling like, oh, this person's going to get angry at me and whatnot?
That's a very good question. I think what's really helpful is to ask the person, honestly, how can I help you? Like, what would be helpful to you? This makes me angry. You can say that. You know, I wish that hadn't happened to you. You can also say, is there something we can do about that? Is there something I can help you do about that? I think I pay a lot of attention to language because I think we often use language that betrays our deeper feelings without expressing those deeper feelings. And in conversations with friends in particular, I think it's useful to pick up on those signs. I mean, if something is really making you angry but not making your friend angry, and you think she should be angrier, there's probably something else going on there, you know, and maybe you can share more information with that person or step back and think, what is going on? Like, it can't just be that she's not feeling angry about this. She just told me the story. So why did she tell me that? Why did you tell me this story? Is, I think, a good question.
Okay. One last
question.
And we'd love to hear from a man. So,
thank you very much indeed for a fantastic talk and a really articulate exposition of some really important ideas. And also, as a representative of a very, very, very tiny minority
in the room, yes.
Thank you for hearing my voice. I have a very simple question, and that is, when you're very angry, if I'm your partner and you're very angry, what would you like me to say?
That's a very good question. My husband is in this room.
not calm down. Not calm down.
You know, I don't feel equipped to answer that particular question. I can say, though, that based on a lot of my own experiences, research, conversations with other women, I think some of the strangeness of this situation is that we go often out of our way to protect the men around us from these emotions. Yeah. Because the protective instinct, the buffering habit, is strong. So there is a fear, what if this person gets angry at me? There's that. What if this person rejects what I'm saying and doesn't care? There's that. And then there's, I don't want to hurt this person. And I think those are three different things. I kind of joke these days that when I accept a speaking engagement, it should go along with the clause, bring a man. Every woman that comes should bring a man. And it's directly related to this question because a lot of men will say, how can I help? And in fact, the best way to help sometimes is just to listen. Because we teach boys especially to be active, to take control of their environments. And unfortunately, that means girls are part of the environment to take control of. Listening is not a cultivated habit that's considered participating. And sometimes when we're angry, and this is something that I learned directly from my husband, we don't need to do anything. We just need to listen, acknowledge what is happening, acknowledge the validity of these feelings, and wait and say, what is it that you want to do? Which is not a question I certainly ever heard growing up. I mean, if I was angry, the thing that I heard the most, which is the case with many women, is, you sound angry. Which is totally different from what's upsetting you. Those are very different things. And so I know it may seem like an easy way out, but I actually think sometimes not saying anything and listening and then saying, what would you like to do, might work.
That's great advice. Unfortunately, that is where we're going to have to leave it. Now, Soraya is going to be in the foyer. I would say, please do go and get this book. And at every moment, you will be saying, yes, yes.
Thank you.
Tiki torches and pitchforks will not be available in the foyer. But Soraya is going to be there, and she'll sign your book for you. Please thank Soraya.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Yes.
Amazing work.